Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to talk about home sale contingencies for residential purchase and sale agreements tonight. And those of you who are on the call may have done some home sale contingencies in the past, but the contracts that we're talking about tonight have been revised, and I think more of you will be using them in the coming months. And I want you to be familiar with how they are structured and what to keep in mind. So tonight I've got the 22B, the 22Q, and the notices, as well as some helpful emails. You can see some of the exchanges that I have had with recent agents when it comes to a home sale contingency. We'll discuss briefly about the timing of what you need to be concerned about, as well as the title and escrow restraints, things you need to be worried about when it comes to closing the deal once you get it accepted. So we'll talk about that tonight, and that will pretty much wrap up our 30 minutes. If you have a specific question, or maybe it's the first time you're doing a home sale contingency, it's okay to ask questions or to text me or to send Jerry K an email with the contract so that we can assist you in understanding what deadlines you have to worry about. So let's go ahead and jump right in right now, and we're going to talk about the 22B, I believe, first. I'm sorry, the 22Q first. We'll do the 22Q first.
The B.
Oh, got the B. The Q or the B. So that's where it becomes, where if you don't know which the B or the Q, that's where you start to see a rookie agent versus an agent who's savvy. Somebody that's been trained or experienced in contingent sales. The Q is to be used only if the home that they're selling is under contract. The B is if the home will be put on the market. So there's two different types of contingencies, and if you don't know the difference between the Q and the B, hopefully you're listening really closely to tonight, and you may need to follow up and remember or remind yourself the difference between the Q or the B. They're both in the 22 section. So when you're looking at the Q and the biggest difference is that the Q does not have this section right here. It's contingent on a successful sale of the property. This is contingent on the sale of the buyer's property, and it has to be listed, if you look at line number 10, within 5 days of mutual acceptance. So there's really no like extension on that. A lot of sellers, and they're sellers and buyers, they've asked me, Rochelle, how can I buy and how can I sell and not, be homeless? If they start to ask you questions like that, you need to walk them through first a listing appointment and do a good job with the listing appointment. And then also, while you're kind of in process and preparing the listing for sale, it takes 2 to 3 weeks to prepare a listing, to get it staged, to get it photographed, to get all of the possessions packed away that need to be packed. While that's going on, so I have a signed listing agreement, I also will be showing this particular client a property. And so when we discuss the listing agreement and I discuss how I'm going to help them list and buy, you may want to have this printed in your binder or in your presentation so they understand and set the expectation of when they would have to go live on the market. So when I sat down with my clients, the Walls, and they're in Monroe, I actually had to explain to them that if we're going to go on the market the first weekend in May, we have a lot to do before then, and then we have to also keep in mind that we'd have to go on the market live. Once we find a property, we only have 5 days. That does not include the weekends or the holiday, but it is still 5 days. So if we get acceptance on their deal, we only have 5 days to get their home active on the MLS. If the buyer has not sold the property or given, then this agreement shall terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. But we do have to put it on the market within 5 days is what it says in term 1. Now in term 2, let's stay on term 1 here. On term 1, you also, if not filled in, it says 45 days. And as you know from my contract classes, I like to have everything filled in. That means that you've read it. That means your client understands that you have properly filled things in, and you run the risk, if you don't fill it in, that somebody might fill it in for you. We don't want that. So if not filled in, it says 45 days. That means that I have to receive an offer, a mutually accepted contract on their listing within 45 days of it being a mutual acceptance. So the timing starts from the date of mutual acceptance on their purchase and rides for 45 days. Now, in today's market right now, most sellers are willing to look at a contingent sale, but they are not willing to wait for 45 days. That takes a month and a half for them to wait for your buyer to get an offer on their home. That's a long time. So I would cut that down. If you're representing a buyer, I would venture to guess at least give them a few weekends. I think 21 days would be a smart way to go if you're trying to show strength in the way you properly market and position their home. So in the offer that I got accepted for the walls recently, I did the 21 days on that, and the seller did accept it. I was up to the weekend right before my contingency would expire when it looked like another offer was coming in. So 21 days is probably the right move. If you can get 45 days, certainly try for it, but you may have to show strength in cutting that timeline down as we adjust to this new market. So that's what I would say on number one. Number two means let's just play it out like you're not able to get a buyer to offer on your listing, and 21 days passes or it's about ready to pass. You will want to send over a termination notice and terminate so your buyers can get their earnest money back. That has happened, but if you watch your timelines and you work with the listing agent on the home that they're purchasing, oftentimes that listing agent will be forgiving and will extend on line number 8 and give you another weekend. So if you go in with 21 days and you can show the listing agent that you've done proper price reductions, that you've done open houses and you've marketed the property and you have professional photographs, oftentimes they'll grant you another weekend to kind of get it under contract. So I was really close on the Monroe property, but I was able to procure a buyer and we were able to remove the contingency because of that. So number two, we go right into number two, when seller's consent is required. This is a notice for you as a listing agent and also for the listing agent of the home that you're buying, that the property, again, you kind of work out the domino effect, right? So the home that they're buying usually starts the seller. The seller, when you're selling the home to a buyer, that contract will start the initial period of contract where it will start, and then you have it has to be a closing date of 30 to 60 days. So the buyer must obtain seller's written consent, the home that we're buying, if we accept an offer on the home that they're selling that is less than 30 days, it would be a quick close, or it's more than 60 days. So if you're accepting an offer that's just a regular sale, again, if they can't be selling their home, that would be 2 contingencies. That doesn't provide for this. As long as it's a regular seller, a regular buyer that's buying and closing in 30 to 60 days, you're good. You're in good shape. If it's other than that, you'll want to talk with me and see how we can work with the listing agent or counter that term number so that we can get it secured and approved by the listing agent or the home that they're purchasing. Now, number 3, if you look at number 3, their financing contingency does not commence until the contingency is removed. So that kind of puts it on hold on number 3. And it does have number 4. It says property remains on the market. The seller will keep the property on the market in contingent status. So that contingent status, if you're representing a buyer and right now the market's kind of changing and you're looking for properties and maybe it's the lack of inventory in many areas, you should still be showing properties that are in the contingent status, because there is that provision. Anytime you see a contingent property, that means that they still have a bump period or the property remains on market. Seller will keep the property in the contingent status up until the point when the buyer removes the contingency. So the seller can't accept another offer, but they have to give the buyer a notice. And there's a 5-day notice period. When I'm a listing agent, I like to see that bump period. We used to call it bump period. It now is property remains on the market. but it still is called a bump period, and I cut that down to 2 days when I'm representing the seller. If I'm representing the buyer, I like to ask for the entire 5 days because that gives me an additional time if I need to work on financing or do a price reduction on their property to get get it on the market for the weekend, and then I can get an offer on their home and remove the contingency. So 5 days gives you more time as a buyer's agent and a listing agent. But when you're a listing agent and you want to call the shots, you may want to counter that point on term number 4. If I go down to term number 5, what that is contingency satisfied. So anytime that I have received an offer, we got mutual acceptance, I only have 2 days of entering into an agreement with that buyer in order to give notice to the seller or to the listing agent of the home they're buying. If you fail to make that notice, you are waiving your contingency. So be careful on term number 5 that once you get mutual, you do have to send over the 90K. Let's go to that one next. Next slide. So once you get an offer on your place, you've got to check the box right here on box number 1 where the buyer's property is sold. The contingency is satisfied. What that means is basically the contingency is sold. It doesn't mean it comes out of the 22B and it says the buyer has accepted an offer to sell a property that is not contingent on the sale of another property, and it will close no less than 30 days and no more than 60 days. And it's also going to have a copy of that purchase and sale agreement attached. So for the notice to be effective, you have to attach the copy. It has to be fully executed. That means including the legal description, including everything filled out properly, all the initials. If you send an incomplete offer, you could also be breaching your contract. So it has to be done correctly. And I try to help you guys, since a lot of you are new at this, to make sure that you have a proper 90K delivered to not only to the listing agent, but the listing firm. Both firm note. It's a notice. It's an official notice. And if it's not done within 2 days as required, then you could be known to be breaching, and you could also have some problems with your license. So watch out for 90K, and you do have to watch that timeline that once you get mutual on the sale of their home, you got to send over the notice to the listing agent on the home they're buying. Now, this becomes a problem if you are not representing, maybe you are not representing them in the purchase. Maybe they're using another agent. Well, then that other agent needs to be working and watching closely at when you actually sell their listing. So if you're representing them in the purchase as well as the sale, you control the 90K. If you only represent one party or the other, you do need to be familiar with this, but you do need to know when you need to deliver it. It's 2 days per Washington State contract here. Now let's just play it out. This is the same notice. Let's say that you get to the point and you're not able to get an offer on your home. You can go ahead and send over the 90K where the buyer fails to close and hereby demands their earnest money. You do have that right. Or you have the failure to close, but you want to reinstate the contingency. So there is 2 different types of, there's a termination, which would get their money returned, or there's a reinstatement. Let's say that the buyer, and on my Monroe property, we may have this happen, where the buyer fails inspection and then it terminates. So we would want to go failure to close and reinstate until the contingency period expires. We may have to extend that if it goes to that point. So watch your timelines on the failure to close and reinstatement. And also, buyer has not accepted, there's a waiver. So this is the part where you would have to know which box am I checking for the various different scenarios. Now, if the seller, let's say the seller gets another offer. So we're in contingent. I'm representing the listing agent. I'm the listing agent in that scenario where the buyer is contingent. I put the contingent status on the MLS to contingent, but I get another buyer who is not contingent on the sale of their home and is wanting to bump. They want to bump this buyer number 1 out of position. In order to do that, I would have to send over the 90K. The seller would sign it. The seller would give notice to the buyer that the first buyer responded to the bump notice and that the earnest money is terminated and it will be refunded. And then there's another bump notice that's done for the first buyer. Seller hereby gives notice to the second buyer that the first buyer responded to the bump notice by terminating the prior sale. The second sale agreement shall proceed to closing. So this 90K is the notice form you would use in various scenarios throughout the timeline of the sale or the purchase, depending on who you represent and which box you need to check. So it becomes very important you familiarize yourself with the 90K, or if you have not done it and you're kind of unsure, don't let the 2-day period pass for notice, and let me know when you get mutual on the sale or the purchase so that we can work the 90K. It's all very important with the dates. The other thing that's important to know when you're writing up a home sale contingency is that when it's contingent on the sale of their home, you do not fill in the closing date. The closing date does not get put on the first page of the purchase and sale. The purchase and sale agreement would have that section blank because the 22B takes priority over the other closing dates on the purchase and sale. So when you're representing the buyer and you're writing a contingent on the sale of their home using a 22B, you do not fill in the closing date. I caught one agent, she didn't understand that. She thought that the closing date was the date that's on the contract. What does become problematic is you do need to work with that listing agent when you're representing the buyer and the seller in that situation, and you need to probably do an amendment just so everybody's clear when the closing date would be and when the possession date would be, because you would trigger like a simultaneous close. So I told you I'd talk to you briefly about that. When you have, now in my situation, I think Chicago Title, who's doing the title work on the listing, but then there's a different title company who's doing the title work on the sale or the purchase of their home. So when you have two different title and escrow companies, it becomes very difficult, almost near impossible, to close both properties, the sale and the purchase, simultaneously. It has been known to be done, but you'll have to work the possession date and the closing date out with the other party. Let them know that we need to kind of get a proper moving plan set up so that everybody has their moving truck set up and there's enough time to properly close on the one, possess the home if we need to early, a one-day possession. Anytime you do a possession, you got to use a Form 65, and then make sure everybody knows what moving dates and when closing date would be for the sale, the purchase, the sale, and the purchase. There are multiple homes that are closing, and it can be done on the same day, but it's very rare that it's done right. You've got a lot of deadlines that have to be met. If you're using the same title and escrow company for all the sales, you're probably less likely to have problems, but more likely if you have different title and escrow companies working along the way. I've done it. It can be done, but it's the percentages of it working out is very, very low. So watch the closing dates on those. Next slide. This is the bump response Form 46 that you would use if you were the listing agent. You would use this if the contingency has satisfied, the buyer has accepted an offer, and if you were served a notice, a bump response, you would need to see, there's a bump reply. And so there's two different forms you would use, 44 or 46, depending on if you represent the seller or if you represent the buyer. So if you read it, this is in response to a notice that the seller has accepted another offer to purchase the property, and the buyer gives notice as follows. The buyer has three choices. The buyer the property had sold, so the contingency is satisfied. The buyer's property is not sold, the contingency is waived, or the buyer's property not sold and the agreement is terminated. So that when you get served a notice, the buyer has the right to basically, you have three paths. It's kind of like choose your own adventure. Which path does your buyer want to select? And depending on their financial situation, if they can carry two mortgages, if they feel comfortable removing the contingency, they have those rights, either box 1, box 2, or box 3, the buyer signs. When you send the response, it needs to be sent to the listing agent and it needs to be sent to the listing firm. So don't forget to do those two steps. The bump notice Form 44, this is the form you would send over if you represent the seller, and the seller is wanting to, say you got another offer that was not contingent on the sale of a home and you're trying to bump that other buyer out of position. you as a listing agent would send over Form 44. You should send it not only to the buyer's agent, but also to their firm, just to make sure that they know and that they have proper advice by their managing broker or their designated broker. Like I would see it come through our support email, our firm email address for delivery, and that would flag me to talk with that agent to make sure they understand how to do a contingency. There are so many brokers that have got into the business in the last 5 years who have not experienced how to do home sale contingencies. So don't expect that the buyer's agent you're working with knows how to do it. You may have to lead them down the path. And the way to properly communicate that would be to send it to their firm as well as to them. That way that we keep everybody on notice. So you would send this to them unless the buyer gives notice before the bump period expires. Then the buyer would use the response to complete their response. So that triggers Form 44 triggers the 46 to be prepared by the buyer's agent and sent over in response. Last slide. Okay, so I'll end with the 22Q and give you some emails. The 22Q is only to be used if the listing that you're representing, or if, let's say they sold their home in California or Nevada, and you drafted an offer, it's contingent on the sale, the successful closing. I wish that would be the successful closing of the property instead of the pending sale, but basically it's in pending status, whether it be in our state or another state. They've already got it on the market. They already have a buyer for their home. This would be a contingent sale that you would use normal addenda, regular purchase and sale agreement. You would not use a B if they already have it under contract, if they already have their home mutually accepted. Maybe it's not been inspected yet, but they have a buyer for their property. And they would put the date, the address of the property here, and the date of the pending sale. That's the date that it's pending. The complete purchase and sale agreement goes attached. If it's not attached, it's not a binding contract. We ask for that. When you use the 22Q, we ask for you to also send us a copy of the purchase and sale agreement. We are looking to make sure that it's going to close in a reasonable time. And the buyer may not extend the closing date of the pending sale if without the prior permission of the seller's written consent. So it locks in the closing date when you have a pending sale contingency. If there's a failure, if there's something that happens, there are some rules that we follow, but if it fails, you only have 2 days of learning that it failed to give notice to the seller to move on. And every state has different laws in regards to the pending sale. So be sure you watch that when you are representing the buyer and when you're representing the seller on the pending sale. If I'm representing the listing agent and I get a 22Q that's in one of the bundle, I'm going to do my due diligence for my seller and ask a lot of questions before I accept the 22Q. I want to know if that buyer's agent has removed, or the listing agent has removed the inspection contingency, where they are in the process. I want to ask more questions about their financing, if they have a pre-approval letter for the sale of their home. I want to know how far along they are to closing. If obviously the closing date is, only 2 weeks away, it's a very strong offer because they have to have a place to move to. So I don't think a 22Q is a bad addendum. It actually is very good. I've explained that to you guys before, but just ask more questions if you're the listing agent, and make sure that if you're the listing agent, you've looked at that purchase and sale agreement of the buyer that had written on their home that they're selling, to make sure that it's buttoned up, that all of the things are filled out correctly, and that you understand the timelines that are at stake. If you don't, you're not representing your seller very well. If you're a buyer's agent and you fail to give notice to the seller within 2 days, you also are running the risk that you are breaching the contract. So be careful on that, because they could be known to waive their financing contingencies. And that would be all the contingencies: inspection, finance, all of the above, if you don't watch the 2 days period of time. Next slide. This is one email I sent off to Chris. I was mentioning Chris, my listing. Chris and Lisa, I wish I had great news on our offer, but they procured a very strong counteroffer. I don't think we copied all of the email. I apologize for that. I'm guessing it's because of our home sale contingency. This isn't an email I sent off because we got a counteroffer, and because we used a 22B, they didn't give us all of our closing costs. I asked for closing costs, I asked for a reduction in price, and I asked for the home sale contingency, a 22B, and this is an email communicating that a counteroffer. So I said, Chris and Lisa, I wish I had great news on our offer, but they procured a very strong counteroffer because of our closing costs. I'm guessing it's because of our home sale contingency. We have 3 choices. We can counter their counteroffer. We could do nothing and get an offer on our property that's not contingent on the home. We have 3 choices. So I gave them some choices. I have a call into their agent to get an understanding of their reasoning, but I'm guessing these things. Let me know what choice you would like to do. Enjoy your drive. Catherine and the photographer were amazed at how everything looked, trying to build some rapport. Again, this is not good news for Chris and Lisa, but they did go ahead and accept their counteroffer, and then we became mutual or contingent on the sale of their home. Their home was then listed, and then this is some more email exchange between the listing agent and me, as I'm the buyer's agent, but also listing agent. This is the listing agent who basically said, can you let me know how things are going with their home sale, when the contingency will be removed? I just got notice that we'll be receiving another offer. So she's kind of hinting at me or prompting me to send, give her an update so she knows whether she's going to need to send the 90K or not, or the bump. So she wouldn't have to do the bump, and I haven't sent the 90K. So it's kind of that uneasy, during the period of 21 days, this is on week 2, where she's getting a lot of showings on her property, but it's in contingent status. So that's the email that she sent me. I think it's a really well done email. It's not too wordy, not too much information, but just keeps that buyer's agent or that listing agent focused on the prize. I like the way Christy Keenbortz put that together. Then she sent, hey, Shannon and Rochelle, please see attached seller's response to the 35R. Again, we're in inspection negotiation. The sellers are willing to make the repairs. Please confirm receipt. Let me know if you have any questions. We are in the process of doing the inspection response. And on top of that, we got an offer accepted on their property. So that's kind of the flow right now. We're seeing the properties moving very swiftly, and you guys have to be well-versed in what forms and when to use those forms. Hi, Christy, see attached. We are moving forward with the purchase, accepting the seller's terms. That is the link, or that's the email body that Shannon used, and she attached the 90K. So see attached, the only thing I would do different, Shannon, would be to say see attached 90K. We are moving forward with the purchase, accepting the seller's terms, and that's in regards to the 90K. Christy Keenborg, this is in response to Christy Keenborg saying, can you tell me when they are planning to close or possession? The standard 3 days after closing is June 17th. Also, the sellers would like to know if the buyers would like any of the furniture. I believe they would be willing to leave at no charge. If they are interested, let me know. So again, a little bit of, needing some more training by Christy at Redfin. The closing date is, we need to clarify the closing date, and that's something that we'll have our transaction coordinator do, is make sure that we have enough time, that the listing agent has enough time to work with the closing date. But the 3 days after closing, June 17th, we need 3 days to move out of our home. So we're planning on closing on simultaneously. Since we're using a different title and escrow company, we need to make sure that we close on their purchase. It has to be done simultaneously. And so we're going to need to make sure that we have those dates lined up and corrected. A Form 34 is perfectly fine to use if you're correcting a closing date. Just the closing date is, put the date. The possession date is, and the date. That would be clear enough for the listing agent. Then both buyer and seller need to initial that change. And then if it's a possession date other than closing date, we do need a Form 65. And it depends on who's living in the property and who needs to sign where on the Form 65. Last slide, I think that's it. Perfect timing. So we covered a lot of ground, a lot of forms. I apologize if I went too fast for some of you who are new to the company, but you do need to be familiar with the 90K, the 44, the 46, as well as the 22B and the 22Q. you at least have to have a familiarity with them so that when I'm spouting off, use this, use that, you'll know what and how to advise your client. There is some informational tutorials that you can refresh your mind on. If you can, let me share my screen here real quick and I'll show you where to go if you need some additional help. If you go to the MLS, and I've showed this before, if you go to Express Forms, for those of you who are newer or maybe need a refresher on some of the form numbers, go to Express Forms. And then if you go down to the form number, remember the 22B or the 22Q, you're like, ooh, I forgot what Rochelle's told me. You can go here to the manual and it will advise you on how to fill it out or what to do on filling it out. Also on 22Q, that's the one I'm going to show you because we're seeing 22Q used a lot now in offers. Now that you have your home under contract and you want to go out and look for a property this next weekend, you could write a 22Q up, but see how it says use this form only if the buyer has a prior to this purchase and sale agreement already entered in, basically a mutual contract. Do not use this form if the buyer has not entered into an agreement to sell the buyer's property or plans to do so. That would be a 22B. So A is the important part. If you scroll down, it's going to tell you how to fill in. It tells you what to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then 7, remember on 22Q that this contingency does not, the inspection contingency commences upon mutual acceptance. It also does the same thing in 22B. So if you have a home sale contingency, whether you use a B or a Q, your inspection contingency commences upon mutual acceptance. It's a very important point. Some of you have talked with me and said, Rochelle, we don't want to put money up for an inspection until we remove our home sale contingency in the B. You'd only be able to do that if you write some language in there in the 22Q or the 22B so that it alerts the seller and they're okay with the contingency of the inspection being done not upon mutual, but upon the removal of the home sale contingency. So you need some specific language if you are going to write something like that in. Otherwise, you guys have to get the inspection lined up right away upon mutual and not wait until the home sale contingency because there's no provision in the Q or the B that allows for that to happen. Okay, so that's what I wanted to show you guys. Hopefully you took some good notes or you know where to go to find some information. We'll catch you next Monday. We're going to wrap up our buyer sequence next Monday and then we'll start our seller sequence after that. But I do have a lot of questions about home sale contingencies that have come up. So be sure you take heart if you're representing a seller or you represent a buyer who has a home to sell. You need to familiarize yourself with the forms that we talked about today. Have a great night, you guys, and we'll catch you next week.